Captain Richard Hale shoved Judge Naomi Carter against the hood of his cruiser, pressing her down as if she were nothing. To him, she was just another black woman to silence, but in truth, she was a federal judge sworn to uphold the very law he was breaking. The sound of her briefcase crashing to the ground wasn't just paper scattering, it was dignity being trampled. How far would a racist cop go when blinded by arrogance, and what happens when he learns he picked the wrong woman to crush? If this moment makes you feel anger or disbelief, tap like and share, because what follows will shake you even more. I remember that night like rain on glass, loud but somehow far away. Atlanta was drowning in a steady downpour, streetlights bleeding yellow across the courthouse's slick concrete. Thunder rolled in lazy waves somewhere past the high-rises, the kind that makes you hunch your shoulders without knowing why. It was too late for anyone to still be working, but the Richard B. Russell building never really sleeps. I was cutting through the federal garage keys in my pocket, thinking about nothing more important than dry socks. That's when Judge Naomi Carter came out. You don't mistake her for anyone else once you've seen her work. 45 poise, the kind of calm that settles a room. That day she'd been on the bench 14 hours straight, wrestling a racketeering case that had half the city talking. Even from a distance, you could see the fatigue in her shoulders, but it never touched her eyes. Those stayed steady, alert the way pilots keep their hands light on the controls when the wind picks up. She carried a leather briefcase tight to her side, heavy. You could tell by the way her step adjusted to it. Not just papers in there. Responsibility, authority, the kind that doesn't shout to be heard. She hit the threshold of the garage and the night shifted. The air, the sound, all of it. A voice cracked through the rain like a baton on metal hands on the car. Face the vehicle now. It echoed off the pillars and came back wrong, bigger than it should have been. I rounded a support beam and saw 3 cruisers fanned into a corner. Light bars pulsing red and blue in the wet. 4 people federal clerks I recognized from daytime were pinned along a concrete barrier, palms spread, heads turned away from the spray. One of them, a young woman who always brought cupcakes on Fridays, was crying so hard her shoulders shook. "Please, please, we work here," she kept saying, but the words didn't land anywhere safe. Judge Carter stopped dead. Not a dramatic stop, no flinch, no gasp. Just a full halt like a mine shifting gears faster than a body can. The rain hammered the ground around her heels. She tracked the scene once, twice, the way a surgeon scans the monitors before touching a single instrument. I was close enough to see her breathing change. Not panic, not even anger, just calculation. A quiet audit of everything wrong. It wasn't just the tone, it was the formation. The cruisers boxed the clerks like livestock noses inward. The officers stood too close for any credible pat-down. No one was logging IDs or time of detention, and the command's short-stacked barked came from a place that sounded more like pride than the probable cause. I've watched enough arrests in that garage to know what they're supposed to look like. This wasn't it. Judge Carter shifted her briefcase to her left hand and took 3 measured steps forward. "Ma'am, don't," I hissed before I could stop myself, and then hated the word. She didn't look back. She didn't need me. Another shout cracked the air. I said, "Face the car." The crying clerk choked out a plea that dissolved into the hiss of the rain. The moment pinched down small, just the judge, the clerks. The color of the lights on wet cement. Something in the posture of the officers made the hair rise on my arms. Elbows flared, chins jutted, a stance people take when they want to be obeyed, not when they're trying to be right. Judge Carter raised a single hand, not high, not in challenge, just enough to ask for a word. "Officers," she called, clear and neutral, the voice I've heard bring a courtroom to heel without raising a decibel. "I need to understand the basis for this detention. This is federal property." The nearest officer didn't look at her. He leaned harder over the clerk, who was sobbing, spreading her fingers along the cold barrier like he was smearing fingerprints. Another officer flicked his eyes toward the judge, then away like looking too long might grant her legitimacy. The third one, older, stockier, tracked her approach with a stare that tried to pin her where she stood. The storm pushed a gust through the open mouth of the garage and sent a sheet of rain across the floor. Judge Carter didn't move. Her briefcase dripped steadily at her side. "They are court personnel," she said, each syllable even. "State the cause." I felt that small electric swing you get when a situation tips from uncomfortable to wrong. The officers had options here, explained back up. Call it in, take the temperature down. Instead, the stocky one took a step like a dare. He wasn't yelling now. He smiled with half his mouth, the kind of smile that isn't about humor. Ma'am, he said finally, giving her a sliver of attention, step back and let us do our job. She didn't. She couldn't. You could see it in the set of her jaw. You don't spend your life under the weight of the law just to look away when it's being twisted. Your job, she replied, requires reasonable suspicion, proper identification, and an explanation of cause on federal grounds. None of which I've heard. The crying clerk made a sound that was almost a laugh and a sob at once, that awful hiccup of hope and fear colliding. One of the officers snapped quiet and slammed a palm against the barrier beside her head. The smack ricocheted through the garage. That was the moment for me. The snap inside the snap. The line between control and cruelty. Judge Carter's gaze slid to that hand, then back to the men holding the line. She took one step more, just inside the space where voices don't have to carry to be heard. Stop, she said, not loud but final. It wasn't bravado. It wasn't a challenge tossed into the wind. It was a command from someone who understood exactly what was supposed to happen in a place like this and what absolutely could not. The stocky officer rocked forward on his heels, surprised that the world hadn't tilted in his favor the way it usually does when someone barks. The rain kept drumming. The lights kept pulsing. The clerks kept their faces against the cold, wet wall. The judge's briefcase dripped a slow, stubborn metronome onto the concrete. And in that heartbeat between a hand lifted and a hand lowered, between silence and the next bad decision, you could feel the whole night holding its breath. This was the hinge. Either the officers would step back into procedure, or someone was going to break something that couldn't be fixed by morning. I wish I could say the thunder cracked, then that the sky itself tried to warn us. It didn't. The warning was already there, standing in front of them in a black coat with rain slicking down the sleeves, asking for the law by its name. He came in hard gravel, popping under tires, wipers, thrashing the Ford Explorer, nosing through the wash of rain like a boat cutting wake. The driver's door whipped open and Captain Richard Hale stepped out. 52 broad through the chest, chin tight as a fist. His face had that overcooked look men get when they spend too many years swallowing heat and calling it pride. Even from across the garage, you could see the telltale fatigue around his eyes. But there was something else riding shotgun with it, resentment maybe, or the kind of anger that collects interest. I didn't know his metrics or his meetings that night. I learned those later: the clearance rates sliding south, the budget trimmed to the bone, the 3 use of force complaints stamped into his inbox inside 2 weeks. But even before I knew any of that, I could feel the pressure rolling off him like steam. Some people wear authority like a uniform. Hale wore it like a bruise. He didn't hesitate. He took in the clerks, the cruisers, the judge with the briefcase, and he made a decision with his jaw. Hands on the car. No one talks, he barked the words, snapping in the wet air. They echoed around the concrete and came back meaner. The crying clerk stiffened. The others flinched the way people do when they don't know whether the next sound they hear will be an order or a blow. Judge Carter didn't flinch. She moved up one pace, no rush, no drama, just enough to be heard without shouting. Captain, she said, clear as a gavel strike. This is federal property. I need the lawful basis for this detention. Hale's gaze slid to her like a weight. He started at the briefcase, rode it up the rain-dark sleeve, paused at the set of her shoulders, and finished at her face. It wasn't curiosity. It was assessment, the kind people do when they're choosing how hard to lean. He let his eyes say what his mouth didn't. Who do you think you are? He shifted his stance wider, shoulders squared. I said hands on the car, he repeated, as if the sentence itself contained the law's full text. His voice carried that particular promise some men make when they're used to getting compliance first and explanations never. The judge didn't crowd him, didn't try to match volume. Name the cause, she said. If there's probable cause or reasonable suspicion for a stop, say it. If there isn't, you're detaining court staff without authority. For a heartbeat, Hale just looked at her. There was rain on his collar, rain on the brim of his cap, rain silvering the stubble along his jaw. He gave a short, dry laugh that never reached his eyes. The kind of sound that says, I don't explain myself to people like you. He turned his head past her deliberately and spoke to his officers as if the judge were air. "Maintain positions," he ordered. "Do not engage. Keep their hands where you can see them." His gaze cut back. "Ma'am, step away and let us work." She didn't move. "Your work is constrained by the Constitution," she said, calm, as if she were reciting a schedule. "Start there." The line was simple, almost gentle, but it landed like a wedge. I watched his jaw set harder. Later, I'd think about everything sitting under the surface of that moment. The lousy month, the supervisors breathing down his neck, the deep itch to reassert control over something, anything. But standing there soaked through and listening to thunder rumble, what I felt was smaller and uglier, a man who needed the room to know he was in charge. He stepped closer, boots leaving dark ovals on the concrete. The clerks kept their eyes on the wall. One of them sniffled hard, trying to strangle the sound in her throat. The officer nearest her planted his palm next to her shoulder again, hard enough to make the metal hum. The judge glanced at that hand, then back at Hale. Her voice didn't lift, but it tightened like a rope pulled taut. "Captain, you are on notice. You will state your cause or release them." He smiled with half his mouth. On notice, he repeated, tasting the words as if their shape annoyed him. "Here's your notice. This is an active investigation, and you are interfering." He tilted his head the way people do when they plan to enjoy not compromising. "Last warning. There's a particular silence that shows up just before a bad choice. It isn't quiet. It's crowded with all the things that could be said and aren't." The garage filled with that silence. Somewhere, water ticked from a pipe into a puddle. The light bars threw restless color across the judge's coat. I could feel my own pulse in my jaw. "State the basis," she said again, not budging. "Who reported what was observed? Who is the detaining officer of record?" He gave her the slow once-over again, head to toe this time, an inspection designed to belittle more than to see. You didn't have to be a mind reader to hear the subtext: a black woman with a briefcase and a voice he didn't care to hear. The rain hissed around us like a crowd whispering. He let the seconds stretch, then cut them short with another command louder. "Hands on the car," I said. "No one opens their mouth unless I ask a question." The young clerk hiccuped a sob. "We're court staff," she blurted, unable to help herself. "We're just going home." "Quiet," the nearest officer snapped. Judge Carter shifted her weight forward a fraction enough to reclaim the air between them. "Captain, you may not silence the fact of their status," she said. "Identify yourself. Identify the grounds. Or stand down." He squared up until there was barely a yard between them. I could see his pupils narrow. Some men hear limits and interpret them as dares. He was one of those men. And yet, this is important, he still had off-ramps. He could have asked a name given a reason called a supervisor. He could have cracked the pressure valve without losing face. Instead, he chose the only option that promised heat. "Step back," he said, softer now, which made it worse. "Or you'll be detained for obstruction." He didn't blink. She didn't either. "Detain the law on federal ground," she said, "and you will answer for it." It was like watching two weather fronts meet, one all gust and thunder the other, a pressure system you don't see until the barometer swings. The air between them thinned. The lights kept strobing. Somewhere outside, a honk cut through the rain and vanished. I felt the story leave the rails in that instant. Not because she raised her voice, she didn't, or because he lost his temper, he hadn't yet. It was subtler than that. It was the collision of compulsion and constraint. His need to reassert control met her refusal to surrender the ground the law gave her. You could almost hear the thread snap. The captain's shoulders rolled back a fraction, then forward like a boxer, settling into a stance. He angled his body just enough to block her view of the crying clerk, as if removing a witness from sight removed a fact from reality. "This is my scene," he said, each word low and shaped. "My rules." "No," she answered without heat. "It's the laws. If arrogance and intellect can strike flint, that's the moment the spark flew. You didn't need narration to understand it. You could see it in the set of his mouth and the steadiness of hers. You could feel it in your own spine. The storm had found its conductor, and the charge it was about to carry would light up more than a garage. Naomi's voice cut through the rain like steel wrapped in velvet. "They have the right to know the charge. I'm asking you again, Captain, state it." There was no tremor, no plea. Just the steady cadence of someone who knew the law wasn't optional, not even for a man with bars on his collar. One of the clerks, the youngest of the four, couldn't take the silence any longer. He blurted out, his voice high with panic. "We work for the court, sir. Please, we're not criminals." His words barely cleared his lips before the officer nearest him shoved his face harder against the cold metal of the car. The thud echoed in the garage, followed by a muffled cry. I felt the bottom drop out of my chest. This wasn't enforcement, it was humiliation. Naomi's brow furrowed, and for the first time you could see the anger ripple beneath her calm. Her jaw tightened, eyes narrowing as though she were recording every violation in real time. But outwardly she remained composed. The restraint was deliberate. She knew better than anyone rage gave men like Hale excuses. Control gave her leverage. That's when I noticed Officer Daniel Cruz. Young couldn't have been more than 26. His uniform still had the stiffness of fresh issue, his boots barely broken in. He wasn't like the others. His gaze kept darting between the judge and the clerks, confusion flickering in his eyes. You could almost hear the storm in his head. This doesn't feel right. But if I speak up, what happens to me? Naomi's words seemed to press into him as much as they did into Hale. She wasn't begging. She was instructing like a teacher in a classroom where the lesson was justice itself. And Cruz, for all his nerves, understood that. His hand twitched near his body cam. His lips parted as if to say something. "Captain," he started, voice unsteady, "maybe we should..." The words hadn't even settled before Hale spun on him like a hammer. "Quiet," Hale barked. The word cracked sharp, meant to wound. "This is my order. You follow it. Nothing more." Cruz froze. His shoulders stiffened, his jaw clenched shut. You could see the war playing out behind his eyes, loyalty to his superior versus loyalty to the oath he'd sworn. It's a terrible thing to watch a good man decide whether to betray his conscience or his career. Naomi didn't look away. She shifted her gaze from the clerks back to Hale, then flicked once toward Cruz as if she'd seen the struggle inside him. She didn't press. Him didn't call him out. She simply held the line, giving him the dignity to choose when he was ready. The rain outside drummed harder, a steady percussion that matched the thrum in my chest. The garage smelled of wet concrete exhaust and something sour, fear maybe. You could taste the tension. It sat heavy on the tongue. And then came the silence. Not empty silence, crowded silence. The kind packed with possibilities, each one sharper than the last. You could feel the weight of it pressing on everyone in that space. The clerks barely breathed. The officers shifted uneasily, stealing glances at Hale, waiting for their cue. And Hale, he stood like a man daring the world to blink first. That was the moment the air itself seemed to tighten. The scene had gone past uncomfortable, past unfair. We were standing at the edge of something that couldn't be walked back. A thread was stretching thinner and thinner, ready to snap. And everyone knew when it did, nothing in that garage would be the same again. Hale closed the distance like a man stepping over a line he'd already decided to ignore. Rain slicked his cap brim beads clinging to his lashes. He cocked his head, let a half smile crawl across his mouth, and said it low enough to sting. "Who do you think you are? Some bargain bin lawyer?" The words hung there cheap and mean. I felt heat flare in my chest. Part anger, part disbelief that he'd say it out loud. Judge Carter didn't bristle. She didn't blink. She set her briefcase down an inch as if relieving one hand so she could place her next sentence exactly where it needed to land. "You are moving very close to violating the law," she said, calm, clipped every syllable set like a brick. No lecture, no sermon. Just a boundary line drawn at his feet. Behind her, the youngest clerk finally broke. The poor kid's voice tore right down the middle. "Please, please, ma'am, help us." It came out more like a gasp than words, the sound people make when hope and fear trip over each other. I saw the plea hit Hale like a match to a dry field. His eyes sharpened, not with clarity, but with that brittle spark men get when they think someone's dared them to prove who they are. He leaned in shoulders, rolling forward, his shadow sliding over the judge's coat. Captain Officer Cruz tried again, voice thin with nerves. He took a half step, then stopped like his own body had reached up and grabbed him by the collar. Fear did that, fear of being written up, frozen out, labeled disloyal. You could see the calculation flash and stall in his eyes. Hale's attention never left the judge. "Last chance," he said, softer now, which somehow made it worse. "Step back." She met his gaze level. "State your cause or release them." Sometimes a breaking point doesn't look like an explosion. Sometimes it's just a small, deliberate motion. Hale's hand came up and closed around the judge's wrist. It wasn't a guiding touch. It was possession. In the same breath, he pivoted his weight and drove her forward, pinning her chest and forearms to the warm, rain-beaded hood of his cruiser. The sound that followed wasn't a cry. It was impact, the kind of dull, final thud that makes your teeth clamp. Her briefcase slid off her fingers, struck the concrete with a hard thunk, and burst papers fanning out in a white slap across the wet floor. Forms, affidavits, names, dates, authority atomized, scattered under red-blue light. The garage swallowed a beat, and then everything came loose. The clerk screamed sharp, overlapping one of them, calling Judge like a warning and a prayer. A second officer swore under his breath, startled by his own shock. The rain in the entryway pushed harder, kicking a cold draft across the back of my neck. Judge Carter didn't thrash or plead. She braced palms flat on steel, breath tight but controlled like a diver holding air. Even pressed to the car, she managed to turn her face just enough to be heard. "Captain Hale," she said, the words steady through the metal. "Release me. Now!" He leaned his forearm across her shoulder blades to keep her there, fingers tightening on her wrist. "You're interfering," he said through his teeth. "You're done." It would have been easy, too easy for the rest of us to freeze, to let the moment harden into something we would pretend later we hadn't seen clearly. But Cruz moved. Not big, not dramatic, just enough. His thumb found the ridge on his body cam and pressed until the light woke up and glowed steady. A tiny click in a cavern of echoes. A witness no one could shout down. I don't think Hale heard it. He was busy asserting a version of reality where force equals fact. Hands where I can see them, he barked at the clerks louder now, as if yelling at bystanders could make what he'd done make sense. The nearest clerk pressed her cheek harder against wet metal and sobbed in apology for a crime she wasn't committing. The papers kept drifting edges, sucking up water until signatures bled and dates blurred. One sheet plastered itself to the toe of my shoe. I didn't dare move to peel it off. The whole scene had the awful clarity of a photograph will end up in a file marked evidence. Captain Cruz said again, a fraction stronger. "We should stand down," Officer Hale snapped, without looking, the words a reflex, the tone a warning. I said, "Stand down." Naomi's voice came back through steel. "You're compounding your error. Not a threat, a fact." She kept her breathing measured, planting each word where he could not miss it. Her calm didn't make the moment smaller. It made it larger because it contrasted so violently with what was being done to her. And here's the thing, I can't forget none of this needed to happen. He had a dozen exits, explained the call step back. Ask for IDs, call a supervisor. Let procedure do the work of keeping everyone whole. Instead, he chose heat over law, pride over process, hand over voice. Somewhere high above us, thunder rolled like furniture being dragged across a floor. The sound folded into the electric hum of the light bars and the patter of rain. Hale shifted his weight to free one hand, reaching for the cuffs at his belt like punctuation to end a sentence no one else had agreed to. "Don't," Cruz said quicker now, almost a plea, but it was too soft, too late. I saw the judge's fingers curl against the hood, not in fear but in focus, like she was fixing every second of this to memory, cataloging the violations in order. Her hair stuck to her cheek. Her coat picked up a sheen of rain. She looked impossibly composed against the machine that was trying to make her small. The first cuff clicked open. The papers at my feet trembled in a new draft, as if the garage itself had inhaled. I felt my stomach drop the way it does at the top of a fall. This was it, the night crossing the line between bad judgment and something that couldn't be walked back. The moment a captain mistook his anger for authority and put his hands not just on a citizen, but on the law itself. The first cuff hadn't even cleared the leather when her voice cut through the metal and rain. "Captain Richard Hale, Badge 3145, Supervisor Paul Grayson, you are in violation of Title 18, Section 242. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It carried the way truth carries, clean, precise, impossible to mistake for anything else. The words seemed to hit the hood and ricochet back into every corner of the garage. I watched them land on faces like cold water. The nearest officer's hands hovered a fraction off the clerk's shoulders, as if he'd forgotten what to do with them. Another turned his head without meaning to eyes, searching Hale's for a cue that didn't come. Even the crying clerk hiccuped herself quiet, as if the syllables themselves had put the scene on pause. Hale didn't release her, but I saw the stutter in him the half-second where his mind tripped over its own certainty. His jaw tightened again, then loosened as if he'd bitten down on something that refused to break. "You're interfering," he repeated, but the sentence had lost a step. Judge Carter angled her face just enough that her voice found the open air. The rain glossed her cheek. A strand of hair stuck there like an underline. "Name the cause," she said, "or step away." Now. Silence moved through the space like a slow tide. Somewhere behind us a light clicked, then another little electrical sound swallowed by the storm. The body cam on Officer Cruz burned steady on his chest, the tiniest witness with the longest memory. Hale tried to rebuild the scene by force of will. Hands on the car, he snapped at the clerks again louder. No one moved. They were already obeying. What he wanted wasn't compliance. It was confirmation. The difference showed. The judge's next words came, measured each one, placed where a lawyer would place a fact. "You have been warned. You have been identified. You have been put on notice that you are depriving citizens of rights under color of law." The legal phrasing fit in her mouth like a native language. She wasn't grandstanding. She was documenting out loud because he'd left her no other safe record. I felt the shape of the moment change. It wasn't the drama of a shout or the shock of a blow. It was the shift that happens when someone reminds a room what the rules really are. You could sense the officers recalibrating without quite admitting it, listing the facts in their heads, measuring their careers against one man's temper. Hale's eyes burned the color in his face gone flat. For a breath, the garage held two versions of reality. The one where he finished the cuff and wrote up interfering with police business, and the one where those words turned to ash before they left the page. He stared at the space between them like a man checking the distance to a cliff. Judge Carter didn't raise her voice. She raised the stakes. "Captain," she said, "step back. I am Judge Naomi Carter of the United States District Court." The title didn't explode. It landed with the gravity of a gavel, cracking the night in a way thunder hadn't managed. The effect was instantaneous. The clerk closest to me made a small shock sound, half sob, half laugh. Cruz went perfectly still, like a man who just realized the floor he was standing on was glass, and there was no room for a wrong step. The older officer, the one who'd palmed the barrier beside the crying clerk, pulled his hand back like he'd touched something hot. His eyes flicked to Hale, and for the first time the question there wasn't, "What do we do?" It was, "What have we done?" Hale's face drained and then flushed a tide of blood that moved too fast to hide. He didn't say, "You're lying." He didn't say, "Prove it." He knew better. You don't bluff a federal judge in a federal garage and win. But pride is its own script. He stuck to it with the grip of a drowning man. "This doesn't change," he started, but even his voice heard how wrong that sounded. Everything had changed the second the right name entered the air. Judge Carter kept going, sealing the record. "Your supervisor is Lieutenant Commander Paul Grayson. You are operating without a stated cause, without a detaining officer of record, and without articulable suspicion. You are on federal property detaining federal employees. Release them," Cruz finally breathed. It was the smallest sound, but in that moment it felt like an answer to a test he hadn't studied for and somehow still knew. His hand floated a couple of inches off his belt and then lowered again, steady now. I watched him glance at the glowing dot on his chest, assuring himself it was still there, still seeing. The clerks, my Friday cupcake clerk among them, lifted their heads a fraction off the metal, as if the title alone had lessened gravity. They didn't turn. They didn't dare. But hope changed the angle of their shoulders. Hale's fingers tightened and loosened on the cuff, a tell he couldn't control. He was a man built for command, and command was slipping through his hands in front of an audience that would not forget. He could have stepped back and cut his losses. He could have called Grayson and shared the weight. He could have said, "Judge, let's reset," and bought himself a path out that didn't end with headlines. He didn't. Judge or not, he managed. "You don't run my scene." "Correct," she said, as if grading a paper. "The law does. There are moments when arrogance feels like a posture and moments when it feels like a bet." This was the latter, and it wasn't just his own money on the table anymore. Everyone in that garage felt it, the narrowing options, the growing audience, the sense that the night had turned into a record you couldn't edit later. Naomi Judge Carter pressed her palms flatter to the hood, took one breath to anchor the next sentence, and made it plain. "Captain Hale," she said, naming him with the care of a surgeon, "remove your hand from my person. Order your officers to stand down, or continue and we will move from warning to consequence." The word consequence didn't ring with threat. It carried the weight of process, the slow, relentless machinery that chews up bad choices and spits out outcomes. I swear the rain itself sounded different after she said it. Cruz swallowed. The older officer shifted his feet. The crying clerk went silent again as if her body understood. This was a place where silence did more work than noise. Even I felt myself straighten, aligning with the reality she'd declared. Hale stood there with the cuff in his hand and his name floating above him like a neon sign. The badge number she'd spoken wouldn't stop glowing in my head, 3145, like the combination to a safe that had just clicked open. He stared down at the woman he'd tried to compress into ma'am and realized she had a title that outranked his in every way that mattered. It's a special kind of stillness when a man discovers his power has borders. We all felt that border draw itself in bright, sharp lines around him. Some men step back. Some men try to kick the line wider. The terrible truth in that second was simple. Which kind of man he was would no longer be his secret to keep. The sound came first, shrill and metallic, drilling straight through the storm outside. A piercing alarm, nothing like the whine of a car horn or the echo of a siren. This was sharper, colder. Everyone in that garage froze, even Hale. It was the federal panic alarm, a system wired directly into the Marshal Service, triggered only when a federal judge came under threat. You could almost see the realization ripple through the officers' faces. Whatever this was, it had just climbed out of their jurisdiction. Within minutes, faster than any of us could have expected, the low growl of engines filled the entrance. Black SUVs rolled in, lights strobing white across the wet cement. The doors cracked open and out stepped a team in dark tactical jackets, the words U.S. Marshals stamped in reflective letters across their backs. At the front was Agent Elena Rivera. Mid-40s, composed as stone, her presence alone could reset a room. She didn't bark. She didn't need to. She scanned the scene once the judge pressed to the hood. Hale's grip still clamped tight, officers standing rigid around clerks who looked ready to collapse. Then she spoke. "Captain Hale." Her voice cut clean, clipped with command, "Release her. Now!" Hale spun toward her, disbelief flaring. His words came out rough, desperate to reclaim ground. "She's interfering with police business." His hand didn't move. His pride anchored it in place. Rivera's eyes narrowed, the rest of her face carved from ice. "No, Captain," she said, each word landing like a hammer. "She is the business. She is the law here, and you've just crossed it." The Marshals fanned out with practiced precision. Cameras on their vests clicked to life, tiny red dots glowing in the dark. They formed a perimeter around the scene, sealing it like a lid snapping shut. No one entered. No one left. Every motion from that point forward would be recorded, scrutinized, preserved. Hale's officers shifted nervously, boots squeaking on wet concrete. They weren't used to being surrounded not like this. Their captain had always been the top of the chain, but now the chain had been yanked out of their hands. Naomi moved then, slowly, deliberately. She straightened, shrugging Hale's hand off as if it were nothing more than lint on her coat. The shoulder of her jacket sat rumpled, her hair plastered from rain, but when she lifted her head, there was no trace of defeat, only authority. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. Her gaze met Rivera's, and there was an unspoken recognition between them two women who understood both the weight of power and the cost of holding it steady. Rivera gave the smallest nod, then spoke again, louder this time, to everyone present. "This scene is federal now. All local authority is suspended. Any continued interference will result in arrest." One of Hale's men muttered under his breath, "Arrested for doing our jobs." The words sounded hollow even to him. None of them moved. Hale's jaw clenched, his face flushed with the kind of rage that burns brightest when it collides with shame. He wanted to argue to reassert control, but the optics had turned. Cameras pointed his way. A federal judge stood tall against him. Marshals filled every corner of the garage like walls closing in. Naomi's eyes locked on Hale's. She didn't gloat. She didn't soften. She simply existed in the full truth of her title, and that was enough to make the air shift. For the first time all night, I felt the crowd in that garage exhale, clerks loosening their hands from the cold metal crews, blinking like he'd been holding his breath since the moment began. Relief and vindication pulsed in the same beat. That was the mini-climax, the moment when arrogance met a wall it could no longer push past. The law had walked into the garage wearing black jackets and steady eyes, and for the first time Captain Hale wasn't the man in control. The tables had turned, and everyone knew it. Naomi didn't waste a second once the marshals secured the garage. She pulled her shoulders back, a voice steady, and began to speak in that courtroom cadence that left no word open to doubt. Captain Hale detained federal employees without cause. He failed to state grounds, ignored lawful requests for justification, and used physical force against me. Every phrase was clip precise, as though she were dictating directly into the record. Agent Rivera signaled to her team. "Secure all surveillance feeds," she ordered. Two marshals split off immediately, pulling hard drives from garage cameras and syncing body cams to the command tablet. The red lights blinked in rhythm, each one another nail in the coffin Hale had built with his own hands. And then came the sound that cut straight through the tension, a body cam chirp. Officer Daniel Cruz stood stiffly, eyes darting between Hale and Rivera, his hand hovering near the small device on his chest. He swallowed once hard, then said it. I can't stay quiet." His thumb tapped, and the video played back the moment Hale slammed Naomi against the cruiser. The cries, the scattered papers, her voice naming badge numbers, it all echoed in the garage, like a confession no one could retract. Cruz's voice shook, but his words found strength. "This is wrong. It's been wrong from the start." He didn't look at Hale when he said it. He looked straight ahead, like a man who knew the only way to survive was to keep walking through fire. The clerks, still trembling, shifted their eyes toward him. You could see it, the flicker of relief when someone finally stood where justice demanded. That's when the heavy footsteps approached. Lieutenant Commander Paul Grayson strode in rainwater dripping from his coat. Older, seasoned, the kind of man who'd built his career, knowing which corners to smooth and which truths to bury. He scanned the garage with a politician's eye, saw the cameras, the marshals, the judge, and realized just how bad this looked. Captain Hale Grayson began, tone rehearsed. "I'm sure this is all a misunderstanding. We can resolve it without making a spectacle." His eyes flicked toward Rivera, hoping the calm of his rank could slow the tide. Rivera didn't blink. "Commander," she said, each syllable sharp enough to cut, "you have no authority here anymore. Federal jurisdiction has taken over. Your captain assaulted a federal judge. That is no misunderstanding." The weight in her voice left no space for negotiation. Grayson shifted his stance, but the set of his jaw betrayed the panic beneath his calm exterior. He'd spent years patching cracks like this with half-truths and paperwork, but this wasn't going to be patched, not tonight. I caught a small telling moment, then a younger officer, one who'd been shadowing Hale all night, glanced toward his captain. For the first time, instead of standing taller at Hale's side, he dropped his eyes, turned his head slightly away. A silent retreat, but powerful. He wasn't going to be dragged down with him, and just like that, the air changed. The shield Hale thought he had, the unwritten pact of silence. The comfort of superiors smoothing things over, was fracturing in front of us. Rivera's words had driven the wedge. Cruz's video had split it open, and the silence of Hale's own men sealed it. This wasn't just a captain losing control of a scene. This was a network of protection unraveling thread by thread, leaving him exposed under the harshest light possible. The climax didn't come with shouts or sirens. It came with stillness, the kind where everyone in the room understood without saying it that the game was over. Hale's world of cover-ups and excuses had just collapsed in real time, and no one, not even Grayson, could put it back together again. The story didn't stay in that garage. By morning, it was everywhere: phone screens, living rooms, the little TV over the register at the corner store. The headline crawled across the bottom of every channel like a cut that wouldn't clot: Police Captain SLAMS Federal Judge. They replayed the clip from Cruz's body cam until the pixels felt burned into my eyes, the shove, the thud, the papers flowering across wet concrete, her voice naming his badge. You could hear anchors trying to keep their tones neutral and failing. Neutral doesn't stand up well next to a gavel being wrestled to the pavement. By noon, the courthouse steps looked like a river finding its banks. People came in the rain anyway. Umbrellas, trash bags cut into ponchos, cardboard signs warping at the edges. They chanted slow and steady, the way you breathe when you're pacing yourself for distance. Justice for Naomi. I stood under the eave and watched a woman in her 70s, church hat, blue coat, lift a sign with hands that trembled, then level it like a compass. Tears tracked down her cheeks, and she didn't bother to wipe them. "We've waited 50 years for a day like this," she told a reporter voice, thin but sure. 50 years of explaining what it feels like to be handled instead of heard. The camera leaned in. I felt my throat close around a truth I hadn't put into words. When power puts both hands on you, it teaches your body a language you never agreed to speak. Inside, Marshals moved with the quiet purpose of people who understood the weight of paper. They boxed evidence, logged chain of custody, built the spine of a case, one signature at a time. Outside, the chanting drummed a counterpoint. A city was remembering its own pulse. Not everything was public. Some scenes happened in rooms without cameras. I didn't see them, but you can feel certain moments without needing to be there. In a narrow kitchen on the south side, Lieutenant Commander Grayson called 3 numbers in a row, and no one picked up. In a small living room with family photos crowded on one wall, I imagined Captain Hale's wife sitting on the edge of a couch that suddenly looked like a ledge. She would have the remote in her hand like a life-ring thumb, hovering, unable to save a drowning, "You can't rewind." At some point, the dam breaks. She folded forward and sobbed, the sound that comes when the story you tell yourself about your life snaps in two. Their son, law student, sharp the kind who quotes case law like lyrics, came in and caught the replay mid-sentence. He didn't need the beginning. He knew the ending. When he spoke, it was a sentence cut from clean anger. You destroyed everything he said, not a shout, just a verdict. Grief makes echoes. That one will bounce around that house for years. Back at the federal building, I watched Hale through a glass that didn't give anything back. He sat in an interview room with lighting that made everyone look the same shade of tired. His hair, which had always read salt in authority, now just looked wet and older. He stared not at the table, but through it, like if he could find the right spot in the laminate, he might see a version of the night where he'd taken one of the exits offered and kept his life whole. People talk about loneliness like it's a lack. The kind he sat in felt like an occupancy, something heavy taking the only chair left. News vans idled their dishes like ears turned to the sky. The rhythm of the crowd changed as afternoon slid toward evening. A pastor led a prayer. A kid climbed his mother's shoulders to see. A clerk from our building, my Friday cupcake friend, stepped to the microphone, and with a voice that wobbled at first and then found its footing, told a city what it felt like to be pressed to cold concrete for the crime of carrying a badge that opened doors instead of a record that closed them. When she finished, a wave of sound moved through the crowd that wasn't quite applause and wasn't quite a sob. It was recognition. At dusk, I went home, and the rain followed me in on my coat. I stood in my bathroom, the mirror fogged at the edges, and thought of Judge Naomi Carter in her own small circle of light. I didn't have to imagine much. I could see her in the reflection of that garage, the way she held herself still, the way she arranged words like bricks. The way calm isn't the absence of feeling, but the choice to make feelings stand in line. Somewhere she was removing a coat that still carried the print of a palm on the shoulder, running water over hands that had pressed against a hood and left not a smudge but a record. I thought of her father then. I don't know him, never will, but I know the outline, a man who learned young to keep his eyes soft and his hands visible, who took detours for the sake of other people's comfort, who understood the geometry of a sidewalk when uniforms were coming up the block. I pictured him younger than me, wrist pinched, cheek turned to brick, and I heard the sentence she must have said out loud in whatever room she used to catch her breath. Justice always asks a price. Some nights it takes it in small coins. Some nights it comes with both hands. The calls came in waves, churches opening basements for meetings, lawyers offering hours pro bono, old cases being named out loud by people who had run out of ways to carry them quietly. The city stretched, and in the stretch you could hear joints pop, stiffness giving way to movement. Even the people who wanted this to pass fast lowered their voices. It's hard to talk over a truth that finally brought receipts. Near midnight, I walked back past the courthouse. The crowd had thinned, but not dissolved. Candles had replaced signs, and the flame light softened faces into something sacred. A woman handed me a votive without a word. I cupped it like it might go out if I breathed too hard. Across the steps, a teenager held a poster with a hand-lettered line that made my chest ache. Respect the robe, respect the person. Simple as a rule taped to a classroom wall. Revolutionary as a law finally enforced. Through a second-floor window, I saw the shadow of movement marshals still at their work, the long labor of consequence. The night had gone quiet, the way a hospital goes quiet, purposeful, not empty. Somewhere in that building, Cruz sat with a union rep and a knot in his stomach, choosing to tell the whole story again. Somewhere else, a clerk sat at a metal table, fingers wrapped around a paper cup, learning that the tremor in her hands didn't mean weakness. It meant adrenaline leaving the body the way a storm leaves a city slowly, and only when it's ready. And in one unremarkable mirror in an unremarkable apartment, a federal judge breathed in, breathed out, and let herself remember a young girl watching a man she loved stand very still while someone in a uniform measured his dignity with rough hands. She closed her eyes and opened them again. The line from that old night to this one was straight as a string pulled tight. People say justice is blind. Maybe. Or maybe it sees perfectly and just refuses to look away. That day the city decided to look with it. And while the cameras chased headlines, the thing that mattered most took root in the quiet, a shared, stubborn certainty that what happened in that garage would not be swallowed by the rain. Courtrooms have their own weather. This one felt like a pressure system settling low over the city, heavy electric, full of things about to happen. The gallery was packed shoulder to shoulder, reporters with lids off their pens, advocates in dark suits, neighbors in church clothes, students clutching notebooks. The hum of whispered speculation never quite died. It just dropped when the door near the bench opened and the judge took her seat. The prosecution went first. No theatrics, no throat clearing. They rolled exhibit after exhibit across the screens. Fixed cameras from the garage, each angle stitched and timestamped. Cruz's body cam with its unblinking point of view. Stills that froze contact into incontrovertible frames. The room watched the night replay itself. The shove, the hard impact against the hood, the burst of papers like startled birds. Naomi's voice calm as ever, naming Hale's badge number and supervisor the statute. Facts arranged into a lattice no one could climb out of. Then the clerk took the stand, the one who always brought cupcakes. She looked small in the witness chair, at first hands cupped around a paper cup of water like a talisman. The prosecutor's questions were careful, ordinary, giving her space to stand inside her own story. Where were your hands? What did you hear? What did you feel? She answered, voice shaking at the edges and then strengthening the command to face the car. The flat cold of wet metal against her cheek. The smack of a palm near her head. The sound of Judge Carter's voice cutting through like a rope thrown across a gap. When the prosecutor asked her to describe how it felt to be treated like a suspect in the place where she kept the court's calendar, she paused, found the jury's eyes, and said, "It felt like the law forgot my name." You could hear a few muffled exhales in the gallery as if the room had been holding its breath. Hale's attorney tried to work the seams. He asked about lighting, about angles, about what the clerk could or could not see at precise moments. But the video didn't blink. It didn't get tired. It didn't forget. Every time the defense tried to suggest a guess, the footage offered a frame. When Hale testified, he went loud. "I was doing my job," he insisted, leaning toward the microphone, like volume could substitute for proof. There was suspicious activity. I acted within protocol. She interfered. The word she did too much work in his mouth. And then the screens lit again, answering him with his own night, his hands on Naomi, her body pinned to the car, the instant where a man with a badge mistook force for law. The room went so quiet you could hear the HVAC. He glanced at the jury, then away, eyes flicking for an exit that no longer existed. Naomi didn't need to take the stand, but she did. She swore and sat and let the oath settle. She spoke the way she'd spoken in the garage, measured exact, not one word spent to score a point she didn't need. Captain Hale, she said, looking at the jurors, not at him, did not protect the law that night. He used power as a weapon against it. She didn't raise her voice. She raised the floor the rest of us were standing on. When she finished, the judge on the bench gave a small, involuntary nod, the kind judges make when the thing said aligns with the thing that must be. Closing arguments were short because the evidence had done the talking. The jury filed out with faces set as if carrying a weight they meant to set down properly. They were gone less than we expected. When they returned, the foreperson's hands didn't shake. On the count of deprivation of rights under color of law, guilty. On the count of hate crime enhancement, guilty. On the count of conspiracy to obstruct investigation, guilty. Each word landed like a gavel strike. Hale stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched so hard you could see the muscle jump. Sentencing came with the gravity the case demanded. The judge's voice was even, but there was iron in it. Captain Hale, she said, you struck at the foundation of the compact between people and power. The court sentences you to a term in federal custody. She set the years down in a row, numbers that measured not just time but consequence. You could feel the gallery absorbing it, some people nodding, others crying quietly, all of us a little stunned by the precision of accountability. And then the twist I didn't see coming unfolded with the choreography of a plan that had been waiting for its cue. Two deputy marshals stepped from the side aisle and moved not toward Hale, but toward the end of the defense table, where Lieutenant Commander Paul Grayson had sat through the trial in a suit one shade too confident. Rivera herself appeared at the rail, documents in hand. Paul Grayson, she said, voice carrying, in the sudden hush, you are under arrest for conspiracy and for falsification of internal affairs records. Another pair of marshals broke off toward the back row, where two officers in street clothes went rigid men, whose names had been whispered for weeks. Cuffs clicked, cameras whirred to life, gasps rose and fell like a single wave. Grayson tried the old line. This is a misunderstanding, but the room had learned to stop believing in those. The marshals read rights. The judge on the bench kept her face neutral, though I thought I saw the smallest release of breath, like a burden lowered by inches. When we spilled into the corridor, the air felt different, lighter somehow, but steadier too. Justice isn't spectacle, it's structure. That day we'd watched the structure hold, and as the crowd parted for Naomi to walk past, no triumph in her face, only tired resolve. People didn't cheer. They made room. Sometimes respect sounds like silence. The verdict had been read weeks before, but the day the sentences came down felt different, like the story had finally closed its grip. Captain Richard Hale stood as the judge read the number aloud, 12 years in federal prison. The air shifted in the courtroom, not with cheers or gasps, but with the heavy certainty of consequence. Lieutenant Commander Paul Grayson followed him with 8 years, his shoulders slumped under the weight of a title that had turned to ash. Others, sergeants, officers, who had signed off on reports that buried the truth, were dismissed, stripped of the shields they once hid behind. A chapter of silence had ended, and then came Naomi. She walked into the chamber of Congress weeks later, not in robes but in a simple dark suit that carried its own authority. The place was full lawmakers, press staffers, citizens filling the gallery. When she began to speak, the hush was immediate. Her voice was steady, but the words came from a place deeper than the law books stacked in her office. My father, she said, was beaten by police because of the color of his skin. He carried that pain quietly because for him there was no recourse. I stand here today to say that history does not get to repeat itself. Not while we are here. Not while I am here. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was thick with the sound of people fighting the lump in their throats. Some wiped tears openly, others bowed their heads in respect. The chamber itself seemed to hold its breath as if walls could listen. It was the kind of moment you don't forget, not because of the eloquence, but because of the truth it dragged into the light. Months later, on a crisp afternoon, the White House lawn filled with cameras and witnesses as the president signed into law the Federal Police Accountability Act. Naomi stood just to his right, eyes fixed forward, jaw set with that same quiet resolve that had carried her through the garage, through the trial, through every headline. When the pen scratched across paper, when the applause rose, she didn't smile wide. She allowed only a nod as though acknowledging not victory but duty. And there was Cruz. Officer Daniel Cruz, once the rookie who couldn't steady his voice, now stood before his peers as the Justice Department awarded him for bravery. They called him the young man who chose conscience over silence. He looked awkward in the spotlight, tugging at the edge of his jacket, but when his eyes met Naomi's across the room, he straightened. Some heroes don't arrive with capes or medals. Some arrive with body cams and trembling voices that refuse to stay quiet. Far from the lights and speeches, another scene played out in the gray corridors of a federal prison. Hale walked past a row of cells, the clink of his own cuffs echoing faintly. Inmates watched him from behind the bars, men who remembered his face from nights they'd never been allowed to forget. Some muttered, some smirked. He kept his head down, the brim of shame heavy enough to bow his shoulders. For the first time, the man who once commanded every room he entered had no audience, no shield, no voice. Only silence. And that's where the story leaves him, not as the captain barking orders, but as a prisoner walking through the wreckage of his own making. I'll tell you what I took from it. Power isn't in the volume of a shout or the weight of a hand pressing someone down. Real power lives in the law when it is upheld, in the truth when it is spoken, and in the courage of those who refuse to look away. Because power that bullies will always break. But justice never goes silent. And that's where this story leaves us, with a powerful reminder that true authority isn't built on fear or force, but on justice, courage, and the strength to do what's right, even when it costs something. Judge Naomi Carter's stand shows us that dignity in law can outlast arrogance, and that silence broken at the right moment can change everything. If this story moved you, please take a second to hit the like button, share it with someone who values justice as much as you do, and don't forget to subscribe to Mr. Mac's Stories for more meaningful tales like this one. Your support means more than numbers. It's the reason our team keeps pushing to create